The surprise Ukrainian offensive into the Kursk oblast of Russia has astonished the whole world. The simple question that most military analysts are asking and analyzing is that despite 24/7 satellite surveillance, drone surveillance, surveillance by AWACS in the ground mode, how was it possible for Ukraine to achieve such total surprise at the strategic, at the operational and at the tactical levels? It has not been an off-the-cuff operation. It has been meticulously planned, well thought out, and as Lavrov was saying, it has been done with full cooperation of the United States and especially the United Kingdom, which have had a major role to play in the planning of this operation. There is of course the contra view that perhaps this operation, though very grand in the media impact, very telling in the TikTok battles, it is unfortunately in military terms will amount to very little, because it has diverted resources from the key eastern theatre in Donetsk and Luhansk, where the Russians have been making slow but steady and relentless progress in the last couple of months and weeks. They have taken New York, they have taken Donetsk, and they are closing in on Pokrovsk, which has been evacuated by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian troops in the east are bitterly complaining that these very scarce high-tech resources, creme de la creme of the Ukrainian army, could much better have been utilized in the eastern theatre to stop the Russian advances where they really matter, where the Russians, if they take territory, it will be perhaps forever. So what has been really the worth of this diversionary offensive? Some people are calling it what is called, some people are calling it an offensive which is was preemptive in nature, was designed to forestall a major Russian offensive which was expected to come in the area of Sumy and Kyiv. So perhaps this was to fend it off. We will go into the motivations a little later. What is crucial from the military point of view is to see how such total surprise was achieved, how such total surprise is possible in this era of total battlefield transparency. Every single tank, vehicle, every single infantryman can be picked up by satellites, by drones, and not just located but neutralized. So how did this happen? So let's take that surprise aspect at the start, at the outset, because from military learning point of view, it is critical for armed forces the world over. Strategic surprise. How did the Ukrainians achieve strategic surprise? The Western countries and Ukraine launched a major deception offensive to the effect that they were keen now for peace talks, that they wanted peace talks. As we all know, Zelensky had held that conference, peace conference, sans Russia. It was quite a media eyewash, because the world was wondering how can you have a peace talks or peace conference without the other antagonist on the table. So that was more of again a PR exercise, a media exercise to read out terms of surrender to Russia, and it sounded quite delusional because on the ground Ukraine was clearly losing. But this media offensive did for the third time manage to beguile the Russians. Let's not forget that the Minsk Accords, as now has been brought out by the Germans themselves, were used by the NATO and the West to lull Putin into complacency, or to lull him into the belief that yes, they were keen for a solution, that they sincerely wanted talks. They did not, because they simply used that period, the Americans used that period of the Minsk negotiations to arm the Ukrainian armed forces to the teeth and build them up into a formidable military machine. When Russia had taken over Crimea in 2014, had it gone in then and done what it did in 2022, it would have gone like a knife through butter, because the Ukrainian armed forces were hardly in any position to resist. It would have been Georgia Redux. But Putin was really keen on talks with the West. He felt they would be reasonable. I think he has still not shown the realization that the West is trying its level best to destroy Russia, destroy it economically, use Ukraine as a battering ram, fight Russia to the last Ukrainian, weaken its economy and bring the country to its knees. They wanted to impose regime change. This was the first time that they used this strategy of deception in terms of trying to initiate peace talks, negotiations, while preparing for full-on war. Russia was poked so much in the eye that ultimately it had no option but to try and invade Ukraine and head off the Ukraine attack into the Donbas and onto Crimea. Russians were quite sure that if they didn't go in, Ukraine had all been prepared to launch a major offensive with the help of NATO, under the guise of NATO exercises, etc. So he had no option but to preempt. So he went in, but he went in invasion light. He was still keen that he should not offend his Slav cousins in Ukraine, which is actually the center of the Slavic culture, the Orthodox Church, to an extent that there would be irreparable breach. So he chose invasion light. The Russian way of war is premised upon full use of manpower and technology in overwhelming strength to just grind down, steamroll the opposition. But in this case, we saw the Gerasimov doctrine of hybrid war being put to use. Wagner had been used in Donetsk and Luhansk provinces to fight for the Russians, for the rights of the Russians. And now they went in for invasion light. The Russians, like I have said, often attacked with 1,150,000 against a Ukrainian army that was 250,000 strong to start with, had mobilized fully and gone up to 550,000. So this had its deleterious impact. But the fact of the matter is that the Russians had achieved most of their initial objectives. They had taken 90% of Luhansk, 60% of Donetsk. They had taken a land bridge to Crimea, taken almost the entire Ukrainian coast, all ports less Odessa. So at that time, Putin was keen to now call it off and go for peace negotiations. The second set of peace negotiations were held in Belarusia and then in Turkey. And a very, I think, favorable peace negotiations for the point of view of Ukraine had been drawn up, a very favorable agreement that Russia would withdraw as a goodwill gesture from the gates of Kyiv, and it would withdraw from all the Russian occupied territories, even in the east, on the simple premise that Ukraine would declare neutrality and assure that it would not join NATO. As simple as that. The deal was done, and Zelensky could have taken a hurrah on a high note. But that is the time Boris Johnson flew into Kyiv and he pressurized Zelensky to carry on fighting. To carry on fighting till the last Russian was thrown out of Ukrainian territory, and possibly even at that stage they were thinking of incursions into Russia. So for the second time, peace talks were used to beguile Russia, to deceive Russia into complacency, and it worked for the second time. This is the third time that the West and Ukraine have used the plea or the the stratagem of indulging in peace talks, of trying to talk of peace and negotiations, and thereby lowering the Russian guard. It has happened for the third time in succession. So that was how they achieved strategic surprise, operational surprise. The Ukrainians, made a lot of noise that Russia was about to attack in the Sumy region. And therefore they started moving troops into the Sumy region, and to that extent the Russians saw it not as an offensive measure but as a defensive measure. Like I said, you can always spot concentrations, but you can't spot intentions from satellites. Those have to be inferred. And generally, general staffs the world over are prone to infer things to their liking, to what they would prefer to believe. And the Russian general staff saw these preparations in the Sumy area, but they attributed them to a defensive intent on the part of Ukraine in the face of a likely projected Russian offensive in the Sumy Kyiv area. The simple fact is that the Russians, as per some media reports, had started demining the border area of Kursk in preparation for a major offensive that would possibly go through this area into towards Kyiv, towards Sumy proper. American satellites picked up the gap, the glaring gap in the Russian defenses. They picked up how thin the Russian forces were on the ground, though there were two very major defense lines which could be seen from satellites, trench lines in the area of bordering area of Kursk. But the simple fact is they were not manned. And a defense line is of very little use unless it is manned. So the Americans saw this gap via their satellites, via their drones, and they passed it on to the Ukrainians that this is the place to strike. This is the place to go and create a major PR disaster for Putin. This was quite analogous to what the Americans had done in August, September 2022. Don't forget, at that stage, the Ukrainians were attacking in the south in Kherson. So the Russians had pulled out troops from Kharkiv to strengthen the Kherson front, leaving a big gap in Kharkiv. And they were withdrawing to the line of the Oskil River to shorten their overall defense line. They were short of troops. They were forced into these shenanigans. The American satellites picked up the big gap in the Russian defenses in Kharkiv, and they encouraged Ukraine to gather their resources and launched a very quick offensive deep into Kharkiv, where the Russians had already withdrawn. So it looked like a major victory on the television screens, but the fact was that area was empty. The Ukrainians had moved into a void created by a Russian withdrawal to the line of the Oskil River. And that time also the 80th Airborne Brigade, armed with strikers and Marder armored personnel carriers, they made a big dash because there was no fighting to be done. They made a very big dash, made it look like a blitzkrieg, and claimed hurrahs of victory. Exactly the same has been done in the Kursk salient. But this time it has been far more meticulously planned, with the British playing a major part in the operational planning. Now, what are some of the salient features? Let's get to surprise at the tactical level. We have discussed how the Ukrainians got surprised at the strategic level, at the operational level, and now let's look at the tactical level. Firstly, the Ukrainians moved their troops mostly into Sumy, into the built-up areas, so that the full extent of it could not be gauged. The Russians thought it was a defensive move, but these were offensive formations. The creme de la cream of the Ukrainian army, the 80th Airborne Brigade and the 22nd Mechanized Brigade, very tough, combat hardened, experienced units. They had brought in their drone warriors, drone warfare teams, especially to be here. And initially, they had not concentrated full brigades. They had concentrated battalions of these offensive formations. There were about a battalion each from the 80th Airborne Brigade, 22nd Mechanized Brigade, a Territorial Army Brigade. So a mix mash of troops which was used to make the initial penetration. Electronic warfare. A key component of the initial Ukrainian success was the use of electronic warfare equipment the Americans had supplied, which was designed to jam the Russian drone communications and their communications between the various units. So this sudden jamming effort paid very major dividends to the Ukrainians in their initial success in the first 2 to 3 days. The Ukrainian mechanized elements found very little opposition. There was hardly any opposition worth the name, and the mechanized elements went in deep. There was nothing to oppose them. It is in the initial rush, some of them went in 20 kilometers, then another 10 kilometers, almost 30 kilometers inside Russia proper they had gone in, because there was nothing whatsoever. There were just some conscript formations, there were some Akhmet Chechen units, and there were some Russian border guards. That was all. Very thin defenses, hardly any manning of the defense lines, and therefore they just merrily raced right deep inside into Russia. They bypassed whatever little opposition was there so that they could penetrate deep in the classical so-called blitzkrieg style. So blitzkrieg styles are very good as long as there is no opposition. Otherwise it becomes a slogging grind like is happening in eastern Ukraine. They used their drones to hit the Kamov 52 helicopters. Don't forget that the Ukrainian offensive last year's a major role had been played by the Kamov 52 helicopters, the Kamov Havoc helicopters, anti-tank helicopters, which were firing from standoff ranges. But in the instant case, the Kamov helicopters were not exactly aware on the ground where exactly was the enemy. The situation was so confused, and the jamming of communications had added to the disarray and confusion in the Russian response. So in many cases the Kamov helicopters ventured over the battle area and they were engaged by the Ukrainian air defense resources, the Buk missiles, the anti-aircraft guns, etc., and 2 of them were shot down, and 1 was shot down using a Ukrainian drone. I think this is one of the first instances where a drone has shot down an attack helicopter. But we learn, there is so much to learn in war. Then the second aspect was that the Ukrainian drones, long-range drones, had attacked all the airfields of the Russians, which would likely have sent in their Su-24 bombers with FAB bombs, FAB 500, FAB 3000, etc. All these heavy bombs to stop these advancing mechanized elements. Those had been hit, so there was disarray even at that level. And then, of course, the Russians in their desperation began to use their Iskander missiles. Iskander missiles, in some places with the bomblets, so that the Claymore mine kind of bomblet effect, sometimes with high explosive, etc. They tried desperately to stop these mechanized columns wherever they could locate them. As the Ukrainian forces moved deeper in, they went outside the range of their electronic warfare equipment. And this enabled the Russian drones now to take Lancet drones, etc., to inflict heavy damage on the Ukrainian mechanized elements. Now the Ukrainians had started the attack with just about 1,000 men, less than a brigade. But the moment they found the gap, they have pulled in about almost 11,000 additional troops have been sucked into this area to try and deepen the penetration, widen the penetration. By this time, the Russians had started responding. They had started moving in their troops. So, one question that occurs at this time is, what was the intention of this Ukrainian incursion stroke limited offensive? Was it just a spoiling attack? Or was it meant to capture and hold ground to bargain for territory later, or to create a buffer zone, as the Russians had said in Kharkiv? This is still being speculated upon as to what exactly was the intention. But military experts, especially like Colonel McGregor and Scott Ritter, have been saying that the Ukrainian objective was the Russian nuclear power plant in Kursk. Had they taken that, had they destroyed that, they could have achieved the effect of a nuclear meltdown, a dirty bomb inside Russia, and caused grievous harm to Russia. But this seemed to be a bridge too far. It is 60 kilometers from the furthest point that the Ukrainians had managed to reach, and by that time the Russians were rushing troops pell-mell. There was chaos on the Russian side, there was disarray on the Russian side. Initially, Putin was extremely angry, and it appears that he fired General Gerasimov, and the local defense was given to an FSB, intelligence general, intelligence commander. There was this tussle between the Ministry of Defense and the Russian security agencies as to who would control this, and I think it is the FSB commander who was finally given charge. He has moved in. The key Russian premise was that whatever happened, they would not move out any troops from the eastern theatre, where they were making steady but very, very significant progress. Like I said, Pokrovsk was about to fall, and the area of Donetsk had already fallen. So it was quite evident that the Russian core premise was that whatever might happen in Kursk, it was an area of low strategic priority. It was an area of a lot of forests. They had evacuated the population from the border district where this had happened, and they were not going to divert any troops from their main offensive in Donetsk and Luhansk, period. Now this quite obviously led to a lot of heartburning in Ukraine, especially on their eastern front, and they were asking as to what is the point of this incursion, apart from the media hype, apart from scoring points on TikTok. What is the military utility of this operation? Yes, it achieved surprise, strategic, operational, tactical. Yes, it initially did penetrate a fair distance through, but it also took away vital, critical military resources from the eastern front, where Russia was making significant gains. It took away mechanized elements, the best units, which could possibly have been used to counterattack, slow down the Russian progress. But somehow the Ukrainian military chief, the Russian general, seemed to have decided that the East was well lost, and he would like to gamble all on this incursion into Kursk. Now this incursion would have been meaningful if it had reached the Russian nuclear plant. It was nowhere near. There was speculation that there was that gas station at the border, but then those gas pipelines are passing through Ukraine and going to Europe. Ukraine could have cut them anywhere. You didn't have to make an incursion into Kursk to cut that, stop that outflow of gas to Europe, to countries which need them badly, Eastern European countries. So the Kursk was out of reach, a bridge too far, and apart from that, what was the value of this salient except for lot of propaganda value, lot of media impact value, psyops value, information warfare value, winning the war on the television screens, which seems to have been the preferred option of the United States, of the West and of Europe to do things for the media impact, not ground impact, but more for the media impact. Some other additional, military aspects which are of value for other armed forces to study is the use of remotely delivered mines. The Ukrainian used remotely delivered mines from the artillery guns to plant mines on the road axis on which the Russian reinforcements would come. They used the HIMARS to destroy the bridges, to hit the Russian troop movements forward, etc. And also they used these scatterable mines to protect the flanks of their offensives. Whatever they did, by day 3, day 4, the tide had slowly turned. As the Ukrainian units moved out of the range of their EW formations, the Russians now began to hit their air defense means, their air defense S-300 batteries, which were with slant range covering this battle area. They began to hit their anti-aircraft guns and missiles, and then they began to hit the HIMARS themselves and the artillery concentrations of the Ukrainians. Now the Lancet drones, they had adjusted to the frequency jamming, and they started their attacks on the mechanized columns of the Ukrainians. They used Iskandars, very scarce resource, very vital resource, but they used it pell-mell to try and stop this offensive anyhow. Colonel McGregor estimates that about 3,500 to 4,000 of the 11,000 plus Ukrainian troops that have gone into Kursk have been killed or wounded, and the bulk of the equipment has been hit and destroyed. The Russians have now started using Fab 300, they have 3,000, they have evacuated their own population and made the way. Now the surprising thing is, how would Russia react overall? We all thought that Russia had mobilized 300,000 troops, had been forced to mobilize 300,000 reservists, which had manned the Surovikin line and beaten back all Russian counteroffensives in 2023. And then they had got about 250,000 conscripts. So the first reaction of any military man was, look, you've got 250,000 troops, what's Russia got to worry about? I think they should use it to first, to snuff out this penetration, and as a follow-up, just keep moving into Kyiv. Go around the flanks of this penetration, go into Kyiv proper, cut them off from the rear and let them starve on the vine. But here comes another surprising revelation. It's amazing how Russia has been tying its own one arm behind its back throughout this conflict. I mean, force restriction, real constraints on the usage of force level have, to my mind, needlessly extended this war for 3 years almost. It now appears that Putin has decreed that the conscripts will not be used in live operations in Ukraine, because he felt it would be a move which would be unpopular with the Russian masses. The simple fact is that the Russian people are now outraged. They have seen how 3 sincere efforts at peace talks, at ceasefire, at negotiations have been utilized to the contrary to do harm to Russia. There is outrage in Russia. People thought that, this was invasion of Russia proper. And Ukraine, this is not occupied territory, Russian occupied territory in Ukraine, but Russia proper. And how would Russia react to it? So there was a thought that they might even go in for the tactical nuclear level. But the simple fact is that the Russians have made their cost-benefit calculations. They feel this is not very vital strategic terrain, and over a period of time they will be able to recover it. They don't want this to hamper their main operation in the east, which is now at the point of succeeding completely. So they felt that a nuclear response would just stop their gains in the east and take the war to a different level altogether, and possibly give NATO forces a chance to intervene and put boots on the ground, etc., and complicate the situation. So, very intelligently, they have decided on the side of caution and patience, and the Russians have declared it, Putin declared it a counter-terrorist operation, not an invasion, not even an incursion. A counter-terrorist operation, and he's saying we will deal with it as such. Like we finished the terrorists, the Chechen terrorists, we will finish these terrorists, etc. In the meantime, the Russian forces are going full throttle to capture, the city of Pokrovsk, this town, and the Ukrainians have been forced to order its evacuation. Pokrovsk sits on the lines of supply and communication. If Pokrovsk falls, the whole Donbas, the whole of Donetsk province will fall. They are also closing into Kramatorsk, and it is more or less endgame in eastern Ukraine. So, which leads us back to the original, formulation. What therefore has Ukraine really gained by a very costly digression? By a very costly digression into Russia proper. Yes, it has made media headlines. Yes, it has, made very good social media, TikTok coverage. As it is said, you won the war on TikTok, but I'm afraid you seem to be losing it, and badly, now on the ground. With each passing day, the position of the Ukrainian elements in Kursk is becoming more and more precarious. The Russians are likely to cut off their routes of supply. They are trying to take that enclave on the border by blowing up the bridges. The Russians have put 10, 12 pontoon bridges to keep that enclave south of that river, fully functional and going. But the Ukrainian force elements in the Kursk salient are under severe pressure from Russian FAB 3000 massive bombs, fuel air explosives, cluster munitions, etc. They are being hit by the Lancet drones, they are being hit by Russian fire assault means, artillery and multi-barrel rocket launchers, etc. They will soon be able to, destroy most of their mechanized elements. Their logistics are going to be a severe problem as the days go on, because the Russian Air Force, the Russian Kamov helicopters, with that the aspect of electronic warfare jamming, now they have overcome that initial shock effect, and they will in all likelihood pulverize this entire incursion, entire force matrix of about 11 to 12,000 Ukrainian troops, along with some Polish, along with some NATO, men in American, UK mercenaries in Ukrainian uniforms, Georgians, etc., what have you. They had managed to sort of put together this cluster and mix it with combat hardened units and special drone operators who were very good at inflicting damage. But this entire exercise could very shortly turn out to be an exercise in utter futility, which has frittered away very vital Ukrainian military resources in a non-productive direction, and kept it away from the critical eastern theater where the Russians are making relentless gains. Be that as it may, this Kursk operation is an operation that will long be studied in the military academies, in the war colleges, in the national defense colleges, staff colleges, etc., because it has thrown up some very useful lessons. The level of innovation on both sides, on the Russian and the Ukrainian side, is amazing. The Ukrainian side has the benefit that the American satellites, the American drones, are providing a total battlefield transparency of an unprecedented, unimaginable level. Any gap in the Russian defenses is being picked up. Previously, Russia was defending its borderline not by military deployments but by the threat of going to the tactical nuclear level, of escalating. But each of these red lines, I'm very sorry to state, has been breached, and Zelensky was recently crowing that these Russian red lines are just naive, just an illusion. Russia will have to do something to restore their credibility, otherwise it will have to accept more pinpricks across its borders. It will have to mobilize in a massive way so that it can now finish this problem once and for all. I would reckon that the kind of outrage that is there in the Russian population, they will fully support greater mobilization of Russian manpower resources, and the time period of the conscripts is likely to be enhanced from 12 to 24 months, and they could be used once the Russians have secured the east. They could be used to take over the defensive tasks in the east, whereas the more combat-hardened units are shifted to apply pressure onto Kyiv, either from the north, either from Belarus, or even from the eastern direction. Even from the eastern direction, which is now opening out. Because so far the Russians were dealing with the densest Ukrainian defenses, which have been in position from 2014. So when people say, look how the Ukrainians made such rapid progress, they went 30 kilometers in 3 to 4 days, whereas the Russians have been inching forward. Well, they have been inching forward against some of the most dense defenses which have been there in existence since 2014. So it's a whole different ball game. Going into an empty area and making a big hurrah cavalry charge, a hussars charge of the light brigade, is very fine when there is nobody to oppose you. But when there are such dense defenses, then I'm afraid the way the Russians are doing is the way to go. There is no other. There is no other way to go. But it's been very interesting how surprise at the strategic, operational, tactical level was achieved, and there's no denying that surprise was achieved. I mean, let's face facts. Yes, the Russians have reacted to it because you were not able to take the Kursk nuclear plant, therefore it was no major threat. So the Russians have taken their time. They have not diverted any troops from the east. They have used the Chechen Akhmet division. They have used the the Wagners, and they have used the Russian FSB troops and the others, internal security troops, to try and contain this penetration, and they are likely to snuff it out over the next few days. Even if it takes a week or two, it doesn't really matter. The end denouement will not change. So there is merit in the critique that the Ukrainians have wasted very useful resources in the wrong direction, trying to gain a propaganda victory, a media hype, and TikTok battles may be won, but on the grounds they are likely to be lost. Thank you.